Good. Well, there's a nearly infinite set of issues we could be discussing. I decided to pick three, which I think are very relevant at this point, but in the Q&A, I'm sure we'll be able to extend the discussion to others. So on the first one, inflation, is this a post-mortem or what is to come? So I read two issues. The first one is what has happened and what will happen. I think it's important to understand what has happened. And on this, I've been working on it for the last 2 years with Ben Bernanke, and we've looked at inflation in 11 economies. And I think I have a fairly good sense of what happened. It is not what we expected, but I think in retrospect, we can understand it quite well. What happened is that in the burst of inflation and then the fast decrease in inflation, most of the action, nearly all the action, came from what we call price shocks. Price of energy, the price of food, which was surprisingly important, especially, for example, in Japan, and then the shortages, which led to price spikes in various subsectors. And inflation on the way up was nearly month to month, was nearly entirely due to that. And then it turned around because the shocks either stopped or actually reversed, and then inflation went down. Now, what's striking about what happened is that in terms of a set of shocks, it's not terribly different from the shocks we had in the 1970s, which led to a completely different inflation process, where inflation remained very high, and then Paul Volcker and various other central bankers had to kill it. And the reason for the very different non-persistence, if you want, of each shock is, I think, two things. The first one is no indexation, so no automatic increase in wages when prices go up. And then credibility of central banks, which basically people, if you look at long-run inflation expectations, they basically did not move, which means people said, yeah, inflation is high, but not forever. And the result is that we avoided, what's known as the wage price spiral, which was the dominant factor in the 1970s. So that's really the story. That's two-thirds or three-fourths of the story. Behind the scenes, so things you didn't see from month to month, but what's happening is that in a number of countries, not all, the labor market tightened. As you know, today we have basically unemployment rates which are lower than pre-COVID in most countries. And so this put a bit of pressure on wages, and tight labor markets lead, to stronger wage demands and higher wages, and led to slightly higher wage inflation. But it was really not very visible. It was not what was explaining the month-to-month movements, which were the price shocks. But what happened eventually, say, starting in the middle of 22 or the beginning of 23, is that the price shocks subsided for the most part. They're still a bit there, but not much. And so this part, which was basically the unseen part of the iceberg, became the relevant driver of inflation. So much of the decrease in inflation was due to price shocks stopping, basically. But when they stopped, we were not, in terms of wage growth, where we should have been. There had been some pressure on wage growth of the order of 1% to 2%, not enormous, but incompatible, inconsistent with returning to target at 2% for inflation. And so this is the situation in which many central banks are. We got most of the way, but what remains is basically labor markets which are a bit tight, wage inflation which is a bit high, and so the question is, what do they do? And I think it depends on the country. I think in some countries they can hope that the economy will slow down on its own and will be fine. In the US, for example, we have a labor market which is still too strong, and we have wage growth which is probably 1.5% too high. So if the Fed really wants to go to 2%, which is its target, then in expected value, if nothing special happens, they will have to tighten in the face of very strong private demand. So this means, no decrease in interest rates for some time. There could be good news, and some of the good news, for example, productivity growth has been higher than in the past. So for given wage growth, this means lower price inflation, And maybe we can land without having to tighten very much, but I think the assumption is still that we probably need to tighten a bit, have slightly higher unemployment for some time, and this will take higher rates. The lesson for the future, I think, is twofold. The first one is I think we may see episodes like this again. And given the geopolitics, given the Strait of Hormuz being closed, you can think of various scenarios. I think we're likely to see big jumps in some prices again. So I wouldn't be surprised if we had an episode which was not exactly the same, obviously, but was not very different. And so the question is, will it play the same way? And that the other aspect is, I think it will, if the credibility of central banks remains very strong, so that people don't expect that inflation will last forever. And I think, in a way, if you think about the role of monetary policy in this episode, it was not the conventional role. There was no need to really tighten very much. Why did they increase interest rates, for example, in the Eurozone? Well, to keep credibility. So it's a very different type of monetary policy from the usual one, in which the reason you increase rates is not you don't care too much about unemployment, but you just want to send the signal that you're serious about your target. Whether they know how to navigate this, how much you have to increase rates, depends on how you perceive your credibility, and we'll have to see. But I think that's an episode which we may see again, I think is the lesson for you in thinking about the future. Let me move to public debt. So yes, public debt is higher than it was pre-COVID by 10, 20%. The good news is that inflation has actually decreased the real value of public debt quite a bit, so it doesn't look as bad as it could have, but it is still higher. Primary deficits are higher. Primary deficits, which is the part without including interest payments, are higher. And interest rates, real interest rates adjusted for inflation, are also a bit higher, not everywhere, but certainly in the US and in the Eurozone. The question is it catastrophic? And you read statements that it is. Is it a non-issue? You also read statements that it is. I think it's in between. I think it's not catastrophic, but there is a need for a fairly substantial fiscal adjustment in many countries, and the question is whether it will happen or not. Now, let me go a bit deeper. The public debt dynamics depend on two factors when you write down the equation. The first one is what economists call R minus G, which is the interest rate minus the growth rate. That determines the underlying dynamics of debt, of real debt. Sorry, not of real debt, of real debt ratio to GDP. And then the other one is primary deficits, or primary balances, but these are deficits at this point, which is, again, the deficit minus, not including interest payments. So let me talk about both quickly. So the first one, on the interest rates, what are going to be real interest rates looking forward 10 years? If anybody knew, I would love to know. I think we are just guessing, but the question is what intelligent guess can we make? So I think that there are two aspects to it. The first one is to realize that we had this incredible decline in the real rate pre-COVID from 1985 roughly to 2019, where the real safe rate went down by 300, 400 basis points. I don't think we can ignore it. It was very steady. It was not due to one event. So I think that as economists, we've tried to think of reasons why, what were the deep factors behind this. And I think that, to me, on the list, the main two factors are aging, because when you age, you have to save more for retirement, and therefore saving increases, which decreases the rate. And then the other is a higher demand for safe or liquid assets, partly for regulation reasons, partly because the world is uncertain, and people and financial institutions want to hold more of that. So I think these two factors are still there. I don't see any dramatic change in life expectancy or in the demand for safe assets, and the world is more risky than it used to be, if anything. So are there elements which make us think that, no, there are other factors which are going to come in? And I think they are, and I'll mention two. The first one is QE versus QT. QE probably decreased the 10-year rates by about 100 basis points is the estimate that we have. QE, if it just undoes QT, if it undoes QE, will probably increase rates at the 10-year maturity by roughly 100 basis points. And then the other is public debt is bigger, and more public debt implies higher rates for people to be willing to hold the larger stock. So bottom line, I don't think we're going to see a drastic change from before, from pre-COVID, but if we were at, say, -1% real probably at the time, we probably are going to be in the range of 1 to 2%, roughly the same as the growth rate. So it's not the best news, but I don't expect that the rate will go above that. Now, that's thinking about the world as a whole. If you now look country by country, or continent by continent, if you want, then the story is quite different, right? In the US, it's clear that private demand is very strong. This is what the Fed is facing and doesn't quite know. And if it remains very strong, this means that the Fed will have to have a higher rate for quite a while in order to keep unemployment not too low. So I think in the US, R is going to be higher, maybe even higher than G, probably close to G for quite a while. That depends on what private demand, strong private demand comes from. Is it the past, the large checks of the Biden and the Trump administration, or is it more optimism about the future? I think it's very difficult to tell. And from the point of view of fiscal, it's a mixed blessing in the sense that R will be higher than G. The growth rate is also likely to be a bit higher than before. So R minus G probably roughly 0, but higher R. Europe is in a different position. It has weak private demand. So by itself, this would tend to decrease the rate that the ECB has to choose in order to maintain the economy. And it is going to have fiscal consolidation, which is not something we're going to see. So I think in the ECB, we're likely to have a lower R and a lower G as well. So R minus G, again, close to 0, but lower. And in Japan, they seem to be back to 2019 in basically having very low R and not being able to do better. So this is the picture on R, which has the implication that sustained differences in real rates have effects on exchange rates. We're seeing it in Japan these days, but I think that probably the environment in which we're going to be for a few years. So this is on R. Then let me turn to primary deficits, and I think that's where the action is or is not. And again, sharp difference between the three continents. In the US, the primary deficit is about 3.5–4% of GDP. It has to go to 0 if we want that ratio to stabilize. There is zero indication that this is coming. So it seems to me there that we can expect the debt ratio to continue to increase until there's some kind of crisis, which probably forces Congress and the president to sit down. What exact crisis, we can talk about it, probably some technical default, some auction which goes badly, some rating agencies down-rating the US. I think it's going to take many years given the importance of the market for this to happen, but eventually it seems to me we're going into a war. In Europe, I think it's quite different. Europe just voted new fiscal rules, and they are tough. They are not quite as stupid and tough as the previous ones, but they are tough. And the countries really are going to cheat, but when you just voted new rules, you hesitate to cheat. When it's old rules, you've cheated for a long time. It doesn't much matter. So I think we're going to see fiscal consolidation there. It's going to be painful. It's probably going to lead to very low growth because fiscal consolidation decreases demand, decreases GDP, or decreases growth at least. So I think there the issue is we're going to see it. The political implication is populism, which is that these things are not terribly popular. But I think that's what we're going to see. So I don't see a debt crisis in Europe. I see political crisis maybe, but no. And then Japan is yet in another position, which is that they have their rates roughly at zero in real terms, slightly negative. And they have very large deficits still. And it's enough to keep the economy going, but you have a sense that if they eliminated the deficits and they had positive rates, they would go back into a fairly strong recession. So I think they are going to continue more or less in the same mode, not for political reasons, not because they are stuck like the US, but because they are economically stuck. They basically cannot afford to decrease deficits very much. They are going to try to, but I would expect that this will continue. Now, what's interesting is if you actually look at the projections of the debt to GDP ratios that just came out, for example, from the IMF, actually the debt ratio doesn't increase very much. And the reason is the primary deficit is very large, but there is a negative R minus G, which means that given that they have so much debt, either 150% net or 250 gross, that actually offsets some of the primary deficit. The debt tends to go down, the debt ratio tends to go down. So basically, the projection is Japan continues. Now, it's a very risky situation, despite the fact that we think that Japanese investors are, stable and will buy the debt. We'll see. But very different in the three places, I think. Let me move to the third topic, which in my sense is not the most important today, but is probably the most important for the next 10 years, maybe more, which is what I would call commercial wars in all its dimensions, so deglobalization, but taking the form of commercial wars. And I've been struck by the fact that there's a nearly perfect storm of factors behind deglobalization. And I think we're going to see more and more of it. So let me just go through. I made a list of five factors, which I think are all relevant. The first one is the old distribution issues, which is we know trade is good, not for everybody. And we used to assume, okay, well, too bad because it's good, for the economy as a whole, and maybe we can help losers a bit. But it turns out it doesn't work. And with populism, and with the fact that the China effect is very visible, for example, in the US, it's called the China shock, there is an enormous demand for protection. Another example is European farmers, who basically are also fighting. And I think the politics is such that we'll have to accommodate some of that. We cannot do it fully through redistribution, and I think we'll do it partly through tariffs and protection. Now, again, you may think it's bad, but I think we have to take into account these aspects. The second is economic security, which is that we've learned with COVID, we've learned with the Thai floods, we've learned with Fukushima and so on, that you may depend, if you have a complex supply chain, you may depend on countries where something happens and you're stuck. And so this leads to reshoring, having things closer to home, or friendshoring, which is the US relying on Mexico to do it. And this, again, means a lot of strong adverse effects on globalization, much more domestic supply chains and so on. The third one is national security. And there's a very good argument for national security. I mean, we'll understand that we don't want to depend on chips from a country that we're not necessarily friends with and so on. But it is clearly misused, or not misused, but overused. Basically, everything becomes an issue of national security. You've seen in the US the Nippon US Steel discussion, where the Biden administration has argued that this is a matter of national security, not to give it to Japan. Japan is a friendly country. Steel is not exactly a critical commodity. Still, it is used to say we can't accept it. Whether it happens or not, I do not know. The fourth one is industrial policy. And industrial policy used to be a bad word in economics and in some politics. It was seen as basically opening the door to lobbying and choosing the wrong projects, and it was bad. But I think there has been a major change of mind on this, partly again for good reasons. I think that we've understood that given the economies of scale associated with new technologies, basically being first and then covering the space before anybody else comes is actually worth it, and you may want to just help. The question again here is that it can be used for good reasons. You basically have an infant industry and you want to protect it because you think it's really going to be the key to growth. But again, it can be completely misused and used to protect industries which have no reason to be protected. So for example, to take two examples, electric vehicles, if we don't do anything, China will probably cover the European market, and it's likely that many European firms will either close or have to move operations to China, much more than they do. Should we put tariffs or not? But a bad example is solar panels. As you know, China is now a near monopoly in solar panels, and they sell them for very cheap, and it's no longer a result of subsidies. It's the fact that they're just more efficient at it. Should we protect the minuscule solar panel industry that remains in Europe? I think the answer is obviously not, but I suspect that you're going to see proposals to protect them and so on. And then the last one is actually paradoxical, is the green transformation, or the fight against global warming. And this is something we all want to do. The problem is that the US and Europe have chosen different ways of going at it. In Europe, we've tried to do the right thing, which is to basically have carbon fees, permits that you have to buy, and help decrease CO2. That increases the cost to brown industries and to whatever product is using brown industry outputs. In the US, for political reasons, they have gone the way of subsidies. Now, some subsidies are justified. Subsidies to R&D, that makes sense. But subsidies to production or subsidies to make investment not take place in Europe but take place in the US is basically a commercial war. And the result of this is that, in Europe, we've basically increased the cost of production on the firms which use brown energy, and the US has decreased the cost of production if you use green energy. And the result is competitiveness issues, which is the same firm on each side of the ocean is clearly much more competitive if it is in the US than if it is in Europe. And we're thinking of we're starting to introduce in Europe this thing called the carbon border tax, which at least takes care of some of the problem. If you basically have consumed or produced a lot of CO2, you have to pay something. But it doesn't solve the competitiveness issue, which remains. And my sense is that this is going to be a major source of tension between Europe and the US. So we have all these things. Some of them are China-US, some of them are US-Europe, some of them are China-US affecting Europe. For example, electric vehicles. It's clear that if the Chinese lose access to the US market, they'll be desperate to sell to Europe, and that creates issues. And it creates enormous problems for countries which do not know, in particular the emerging market countries, which basically had a model in which they were entering the supply chains and then getting up in the supply chain. Now, if the supply chains disappear, or you have to decide which supply chain you're in, the Chinese one or the US one, this creates enormous issues in terms of export growth. So for countries like Vietnam, for example, that's a big issue. For Korea, it's a big issue. Can they stay friends with both? How do they reorganize? And so on and so on. So I see this as really, really important, and I think it's going to dominate the news. It's not happening yet, and there's a number of articles showing that deglobalization hasn't happened. What has happened is more of a separation basically between some group of countries where trade continues and another group of countries where trade continues or even increases, and a bit more separation between the two groups. But at this stage, it's not major, because in the end, the division of labor and the supply chains are incredibly efficient. And so getting rid of it is very, very costly. So I think it's going to be a fight, but again, that's going to be big on the agenda, I think, for years to come. Let me stop here and then answer all the questions that Julia has.
Thank you. I think you're an academic and a diplomat, actually, because I see brewing commercial wars all over the place. But I'm going to make a bridge between what we discussed earlier with Nassim Taleb and I think what you're talking about here. And there's one word that you didn't mention. What do you see as the biggest risk today?
One word?
One word.
Can you guess?
Begins with T, ends with P.
Okay, I'll say it.
I'm just guessing.
With a hint. Trump.
Really?
I come from Washington.
Yeah.
I spent a week at the IMF meetings, and I had bilateral meetings with various countries. In each country, the issue is, what is Trump going to do, and how does it affect us? You know, the examples I took, Vietnam, of Korea, they have to decide, can we remain friends, or do we have to make choices, in which case, you know, if Korea decides to be friends with China, it creates security issues. If it becomes friends with the US, and China is not happy, they lose most of their market. It is everywhere.
Is it an assumption that he will win, or just to start, they're asking you, will he win or won't he win? And it's tough to predict at this moment, but are they asking you from a perspective that they're assuming he wins, and then what?
Well, I'm going to take an easy out here.
I'm
an economist, not a political scientist. If I were a political scientist, I might give you an answer.
Pretend you are.
Even then, I suspect that I would not know. I mean, we know, we read the polls. It is very clear there's this schizophrenia, right? I mean, the numbers, the economic numbers are good. Inflation is not down to 2, but it's down to 3. GDP growth is high. Unemployment is as low as it has ever been in a long time. And it doesn't resonate.
Yeah, people are unhappy.
So the hope is that if we keep repeating it, it will eventually resonate. And if it does, then some people will vote for Biden. But, you know, it has been good for now at least a year and a half. And it has not shown into the polls.
If we separate the noise, and I appreciate it can be quite noisy, from the economic policy and the fundamentals, is the fear that you're hearing, and it's the most popular question I get asked wherever I am as well, what do I think is going to happen? Are we exaggerating the risks?
So again, there were a lot of discussions in Washington among US observers of whether Trump 2 is going to be worse than Trump 1. I think the general impression is yes.
For economic policy?
On economic policy, on everything, because he has learned a lesson, which is that he was stopped from doing a number of things in the first administration, and he's going to name people that he feels good with. I mean, I think one risk, it was discussed in the newspapers, it has been discussed behind doors, but in the newspapers the last few days, is, for example, whether he keeps the chairman of the Fed.
Okay.
And that, you know, that scenario, if you replace it, the chairman of the Fed, by somebody who gives him low rates so that he can spend more, that is catastrophic for the world.
Although you did just say, actually, that rising interest rates didn't help with this inflationary problem anyway. So,
no,
but the credibility point, I hear you. Okay.
Low interest rates would probably lead to more inflation.
Okay. In this situation.
Well, anyway, having a madman or a madwoman at the head of the Fed is probably not something that people in this crowd
would like to see.
Well, maybe gives arbitrage opportunities.
Do you really think he does that, though?
What?
Do you really think he does that, Trump? Do you think there's a possibility of that?
Yes.
I just wonder whether there's a degree of Maybe I'm
Yes.
trying to convince myself. Alarmism about the
Again,
potential
I'm not a
policy.
political scientist
No, I know. We'll leave
or a
it there.
psychoanalyst. But yes.
I'm not even sure that would help. 60% tariffs on China, to go back to the point about the trade war, because he's threatened that.
Right.
I mean, that would take
This he
trade
would-
to zero.
This he would probably do.
Okay.
And this would have major effects. He has argued recently that the revenue from the tariff would basically allow him to further decrease the corporate tax rate. When you do the arithmetic, it's not the case, because the best assumption is that Chinese imports to the US would decrease dramatically. So revenues would be small relative to. But yeah, he's going to put higher tariff, especially on China, there's no question.
I mean, Biden could do that before the election, given the talk that we're seeing. It's very, and admittedly it's an election year, but it's very made in America. You mentioned the climate deal. That was and is contentious because there are so many elements of that that are made in America. I'm just trying to get a sense of how much worse you think the US-China relationship could get, economically, I'm saying, under one or the other.
Again, my sense is the Biden administration has not been perfect relative to what I would like. It has been fairly anti-China. There is an anti-China feeling in the US, very wide, which both parties respond to, and they have been not exactly friends of China. But I think Trump would be a different order of magnitude.
To the point of it materially impacting Chinese growth?
Well, I think that's a big issue, because we can talk about China a little bit. So China is an interesting economy at this point. On the one hand, they're interfering with market mechanisms more and more. There's more and more state control, which we think is not very good for growth in general. At the same time, they are clearly very much ahead in a number of specific sectors where, solar panels, for example, it's not cheap labor. It's just that they know how to make it more cheaper.
But they've subsidized it to a point where they're in a monopoly situation.
They did, but they no longer do to a large extent. So there's a number of factors. I mean, chips that are not quite with the last generation, but they're not far. So it's kind of a dichotomous economy in which you have these sectors which are doing very well, the electric vehicles, and then you have the rest. Now, can you go like this? Yeah, you can go like this if you have an export-led growth, because you produce an enormous amount of cars, you have to sell them, and there are many Chinese, but not quite enough to buy all the cars. So I think China has an export-led strategy, if it does have one. And that's going to make it very hard, right? If you basically, again, that's why I said, if you cut the US market, then the growth strategy of China becomes very unclear. They have always said, well, we have to turn to domestic consumption, but it's hard to do, and it doesn't lead to high growth because these products are not terribly efficient. So I think the reaction of China will be very strong, because basically they are going to suffer a whole lot from serious tariffs. Again, we've said they are going to try to come to Europe. But I think Europe will react and say we can't accept all your vehicles, and we'll put tariffs as well.
On a basic level, China right now is producing, a quarter to a third of world output or produce, and it's consuming 10%. The maths don't work. This export model, given the politics and the economics of the moment, don't work. So in your point, if you can't sell to the United States because they're whacking up tariffs on all sorts of things, not just perhaps chips, EVs, whatever it is, can you go to Europe and play Europe off? Because they also have manufacturers that are going to turn around and say, hey, we need to be protected too, exporters. Where does this end, I guess, is my question.
It ends badly.
How badly? Over what time horizon?
It ends with tariff wars.
Yeah, and that's what I see.
And then the question, a really interesting question, is how terrible, from an economic point of view, are tariff wars? Well, they're terrible if they turn into wars, but I think that's still unlikely.
You mean physical war?
But suppose that basically trade decreases by half in the world. How catastrophic is it? And from a old-fashioned so-called Keynesian point of view. You have less imports, you have less exports, not the end of the world. And you clearly have a decrease in productivity because what was produced where it was really productive, you now produce at home more or less well. But these are not enormous effects. And so people refer to, we go back in history, right? And we go back to the tariffs of the Great Depression, Smoot-Hawley, and we're not sure how bad it is. It's more, I think it's more like a cancer than a heart attack. But I think we'll see this. This means lower growth in the world.
Over the next?
Over the next 10 years is my
10
guess,
years.
yes.
Okay. And the commercial side that you were just discussing, the fact that we're going to see more and more industries subsidized, the protectionism, I think the US steel, Nippon Steel, is interesting.
Yeah.
I don't think this deal can be stopped on national security grounds, but President Biden has said, I don't want the deal to happen.
But that's a good example. Another interesting example is, as you probably have read, the Dawn raid on the Chinese firm in Brussels, on the grounds that they were subsidized. Not on the grounds that they were spying, which probably they were, but on the ground that they were subsidized. So basically going into a firm in Belgium because the subsidy that they were receiving from China was thought to be unfair. I think we're going to see more and more of these things.
Who wins in this environment?
What?
Who wins?
Nobody.
There's no winners in this.
No, and they're losers.
What about the countries that are trying to choose between sort of balancing the two relationships? I mean, we went through a period with diversification of supply chains where the likes of Vietnam, Thailand potentially were
take Germany,
options.
right? I mean, the cliché is well known. Germany basically depends on, the Chinese market, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, and the Russian energy before. If you start putting tariffs everywhere, the German mall is in trouble, and we're seeing it. So no, I think it's losers. I really cannot think of a winner.
Okay.
It can happen.
It could happen.
It can happen.
Not low probability events here. Give me the good news. What's the most exciting thing, optimistic thing to talk about?
Well, I mean, the list is not very long, but,
That's
AI.
what I'm asking now.
Right? So we're talking about all the things that we read about in the newspapers, AI.
Aha.
AI, I mean, it's a general purpose technology. The previous ones, electricity and so on, had major impacts on growth.
Yep.
Right? Because these are technologies which can be used for all kinds of things. Now, I think the economists have started kind of looking at what it can do. And as you probably know, the results are all over the map. So, and these are, I mean, I know of 3 studies, there are more, but 3 main studies. So the first one was done by McKinsey Global.
Yeah.
Where basically they had enormous numbers. I mean, you could get 30% more productivity in 10 years. They realized it was not sellable. So they went back and they came down to about 10% more productivity in the next 10 years. Goldman Sachs did the same conclusion. So basically 1% more productivity growth every year, which is a big number when your basic number is close to 1% to start. So it's nearly a doubling. And then recently, one of my colleagues at MIT, Daron Acemoglu, who is a serious person, we did the computation in slightly different ways and concluded it was not 1%, it was 0.1% a year.
0.1%.
0.1% a year is good news, but you want more.
Yeah, but that's a big range between even 0.1% and 1%.
I mean, I think the way I interpret the results is that if you look at existing tasks, then there's improvement, but it's not enormous. And the whole issue is the new ones. What is it that we'll do that we're not doing now? And the computation by Acemoglu looked just at the existing tasks. It's clear, but we don't know exactly what form it will take, that it could be much bigger.
The IMF said, and we were both there, that 40% of jobs in the developed world will be impacted in some way. They thought it would worsen inequality. For emerging markets, just 26% of jobs, because obviously they're less industrialized in many respects. Do you buy that number, 40%?
Not without reading the study.
Okay, good answer. Hypothetically, do you think it's possible, though?
Again, that's a big number, right? Because the way all these guys do it, they look at the number of jobs or the number of tasks. They say, what is the proportion of jobs or tasks where AI can make a difference?
Yeah.
And the number there varies between 15% and IMF, 40%. How they come to that difference, I do not know. And then they say, well, for each job or for each task, you know, how much can be done by an LLM or whatever. And again, if you use 10% or 40%, it makes an enormous difference in the end. The study has to be, again, there are limits, because I think we can only do this with existing tasks. It has to be incredibly granular, right? You have to sit down with each job or each task and just think about what is done during the day, what is it that a machine can do, and think about not just the current, ChatGPT 5, but the ChatGPT 7 or 8. And we don't know, but there is a chance.
I was telling him ChatGPT 4 is not bad earlier, and he was like, I'm waiting for 5. Just quickly, show of hands, who's using ChatGPT or some kind of tool? Interesting. Wait, keep your hands up. Thank you. Put your hand down. Actually, no, I'm going to do a double negative, so that doesn't help. Fine, put your hands down. If you're more productive as a result, put your hand up. Put your hand down if you think you're going to be replaced by AI.
We have an estimate here.
So there you go.
Yeah,
what happens to the world?
20% of the people in this room will lose their jobs.
Is that what you think?
That's roughly
I know, but I'm asking you.
The result of looking at the show.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting, no?
Scary.
Scary.
Yes.
Were you more scared or less scared when we started that conversation? Because I do think this is, and I've done this about 4 times now, and it's about the same.
Again, you want good news on good news?
I always want good news.
So basically, some of the previous GPTs, general purpose technologies, really remove the jobs of the unskilled.
Yeah.
Right? This removes a different type of job. It removes kind of our job, these jobs. And so we actually have skills. Now, we're going to lose the job we have, but presumably some of these skills are transferable, right? And so I think that the effect on us might be smaller than with the previous technologies. Is it good news enough?
It is good news. The aging point that you made earlier worries me, though. I think it's going to be transformative in some sciences, and perhaps we'll live longer. So to your point about demographics being a challenge, I think it could be. Maybe cures will be better as well.
If we live longer, then by interest rate predictions mean that they'll be lower.
Right.
So we have gone full circle.
Yeah. I want to talk about monetary policy a little bit, because you talked about it. To your point that monetary policy, at least in this past cycle, has been used for credibility purposes rather than managing inflation. What's the danger then in order to maintain credibility that central banks like the Fed, and we can use that as an example, are so determined to get to target, to prove that they can get to target, that they tip the economy over? How high is that risk? Because I do think that matters for people in this room.
There's a risk. Again, I think the central banks have kind of lexicographic ordering, which is we have to keep credibility because this is what saved us in this episode.
Right.
Right. This is what made inflation go away when the shocks went away. And then we clearly care about the economy and we care about inflation. And so I think they'll, as soon as, for example, long-run expectations kind of show a slight twist, they might increase rates where on macroeconomic grounds that would not be justified. Now, you can think of this in a cynical way as an investment in the future, which is preserving something which is worth a whole lot, which is credibility. I mean, for all of us, credibility is of the essence, right? So, yes, maybe in the short run it slows down the economy. At the same time...
But you're not worried about recession?
I don't think that what the Fed has to do to maintain credibility implies, I mean, again, I think it implies some increase in unemployment, not because of credibility, because the labor market is too tight. That's a separate issue, right? So this is conventional monetary policy. I think that given the strength of demand, they probably have to increase rates. I'm guessing that they have to increase rates.
Wow, so you think they are going to increase rates further from here in order to maintain their credibility?
No, this is in order to basically slow down the market.
Okay, just checking.
Slow down and maintain credibility. No, I don't think they would increase rates just because they want to maintain credibility.
I know. I was.
But yes, it's a different game when the target is credibility. If this is what you want to achieve, it may be at the cost of, as you said, maybe a slowdown, or it's a possibility.
Do you expect nations like the United Kingdom and the Europeans to cut rates, even if the Fed's still hiking?
Oh, yes. I think this notion that the ECB looks at the Fed and has to do the same thing, if it doesn't, it's not the way the ECB thinks. It's not the way the Bank of Japan thinks very much, right? No, I think the ECB will cut rates because private demand is weak, and basically they just have to sustain it. I think they have no problem in having a weak euro. Again, there's a limit, right? I mean, if it became catastrophic, but within what we've seen in the past, I think they'll let the euro come down if the markets decide to do so. Again, I don't think that the exchange rate is very high in the objective function of the ECB. And as you've seen, it's surely not very high in the objective function of the BOJ, of the Bank of Japan.
Can I go back to the Trump point very quickly? Do you think Trump matters for financial markets? There tends to be sort of volatility, but we've sort of talked about the economics. Just in terms of financial markets, do you think it matters?
I think it's what you said, which is uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
We really don't know. He could cut corporate taxes, and the stock market will do great. And he could do stupid things so that firms have a harder time making profit. We don't know, but yeah, I mean, there's no question that the Trump environment is a larger standard deviation environment, to use a technical term.
We used that technical term earlier. Nassim Taleb told me he's got 10 to 20% of his assets in gold. How do you feel about that?
What did he say?
Yeah, he said he keeps about 10 to 20% of his assets in gold.
He's free to do so.
Yeah? I said he was a diplomat.
No, I mean, gold, I think gold is something, it's like Bitcoin, basically.
No!
It's exactly like Bitcoin, from that point of view, which is, why would you ever hold something which truly is worthless? Well, it depends.
Someone put the clock up by 30 minutes, please.
I'm going to clarify this and say when I would actually hold gold or Bitcoin.
Oh, good idea.
Which is that basically when times are bad, gold tends to go up and Bitcoin tends to go up a bit less than gold, but somewhat, right? So even if I believe that there is no intrinsic value behind, it may be a good hedge. And so for that reason, yes, I would hold gold. I think the correlation properties of gold with activity are actually better than those of Bitcoin. But knowing that intrinsically Bitcoin has no fundamental value, I might still want to hold it if I think things are going to be very bad. Now, there's the extreme scenario in which there is war, there's civil war, and you actually carry your gold in your pocket in order to pay for the bread. I think if he does this for that reason, then he's more pessimistic than I.
I thought you were going to use the digital currency thing there as well with crossing borders.
Well, we can have a discussion.
We can have a separate discussion.
We can have a discussion about Bitcoin. But again, the point I was making is even if something is of intrinsic no value, which I believe Bitcoin is, but that's not the issue, you may still want to hold it as a hedge.
Right.
Right? It makes complete sense. So again, if you think that things are going to be catastrophic and Bitcoin and gold are going to go up, then it's perfectly reasonable to want to hold some.
Okay.